Nigeria is located in Western Africa on the Gulf of Guinea. The country's size is comparable to that of Venezuela, or twice the size of the US state of California. But unlike either of the comparisons, Nigeria's population level is many times higher. With about 178 million people, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa and the seventh most populous in the world. However, not all the people speak the same language or share the same ethnicity. What you have to understand about Nigeria is, it is a multicultural state. There are about 400 different ethnic groups from a number of distinct cultural groups, the largest being the Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, and the Fulani ethnic groups. Traditionally, Nigerian politics has been managed by these four. Aside the demographics of the country, the geography of Nigeria is largely made up of arable land. The eastern part of the country is dominated by a series of mountainous ranges which form the natural border with neighboring Cameroon. The country's most distinct geographic features are the Niger and Benue rivers, which split the country in three parts. The large amount of arable land explains how the country is able to maintain such high population levels. However, much of the countryside is also made up of deserts and swamps, so the population density is mostly set in tight clusters rather than spread out throughout the country. These tight clusters bring forth overcrowded cities and urban areas, which in turn brings forth many new problems for the country. Cities like Lagos, Kano, as well as the capital Abuja are rampant with high levels of corruption and crime, where the strong prey on the weak. Considering its large population, economy, and industrial output, the country is also referred to as the Giant of Africa. Nigeria's external power projection is evident in its economic influence throughout the continent. The fact is that Nigerian businessmen are active all over the region. This refers to legal businesses as well as to black market sectors like the arms trade, drug trade, human trafficking, business scams, etc. Furthermore, the government in Abuja uses a number of Pan-African organizations to bolster its international image as a reliable state and the gateway to Africa. Yet, despite the country's economic and demographic influence, Nigeria's foreign policy is significantly restricted due to the country's domestic politics. In this analysis, we will take a look at the geopolitics of Nigeria, what shapes the domestic politics, and what we can expect for the future of Nigeria. Welcome to Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. For centuries, the present-day Federal Republic of Nigeria has been the site of numerous kingdoms and tribal states, so in a historic sense, there was never a unified state to begin with. The modern geopolitics of Nigeria originate from the British colonial rule during the 19th century. The British Empire had established two protectorates in the Nigerian territories: the directly British-governed Southern Nigeria Protectorate with access to the sea, and the indirectly ruled, landlocked Northern Nigeria Protectorate. The administration of the Northern Protectorate included many of the traditional Muslim rulers. However, these rulers resisted the administrative and financial reforms which were put forth by the British. This meant that the collection of taxes was prevented by the local rulers and merchants. The local Muslims perceived their resistance as a form of patriotism. However, following the tax resistance, a budget deficit soon developed. The protectorate was falling in debt, and so the situation ended up with the British Treasury paying for the budget deficit of their colony. It was an awkward situation for London, and so in order to manage the costs, the British decided to unify the Southern and Northern Protectorates for economic reasons. London hoped that the Southern Protectorate's budget surplus would help balance the Northern Protectorate's budget deficit, and it did. The newly unified Protectorate of Nigeria balanced its economy and remained a colony of Britain until 1960, after which Nigeria gained its independence. The moment Nigeria gained its independence, the old divisions which are set along the Niger and Benue rivers resurfaced. The north of the country is dominated by ethnic Hausawa, who are Muslims and make up 21% of Nigeria's population. This region is largely a savanna grassland and has a sizable agricultural output. Furthermore, many of Nigeria's military officers and commanders are from the Hausa faction. Closely intertwined with the Hausa are the Fulani people, who make up about 11% of the country's population. A significant portion of the Fulani people are nomadic, but much like the Hausa, the Fulani are adherents to Islam. The umbrella term Hausa Fulani is used to describe the country's largest faction. Combined, these two closely intertwined ethnic groups form roughly 32% of Nigeria's total population. The southwest of the country is dominated by the Yoruba, who control the most important commercial zones and have the best ports of the country, most notably the city of Lagos. More than half of the Yoruba people are Christians, while about a third is Muslim. The remainder associate themselves with the traditional Yoruba religion, Orisha. All in all, ethnic Yorubas make up an estimated 21% of the country's total population. The southeast of the country is controlled by the Igbo tribe, who are primarily Christians and form roughly 18% of Nigeria's population. The Igbos control a large portion of the Niger Delta, which used to be a highly active agricultural region, but now is a heavily polluted zone. This is also where most of the sweet crude oil and natural gas of Nigeria is located. Basically, you can think of Nigeria as a disorderly version of India. The decades following independence, these factions challenged each other in their respective attempts to overthrow the status quo and establish themselves as the dominant faction. The tensions between the factions reached their peak when the Igbos, with their oil revenues, tried to separate from the country in 1967. Initially, the Igbos had anticipated the support of the Yoruba in a war against the Hausa Fulani. However, what they got instead was a Hausa Fulani-Yoruba alliance against the Igbo. This civil war lasted for 3 years and cost the lives of somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. Most of them had starved to death. Eventually, the Igbo tribe was defeated and Nigeria had prevented its total collapse and retained its territorial integrity. Nigeria's post-Civil War era was dominated by a vicious cycle of coups and counter-coups, which only stimulated corruption and crime. Balancing the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba and Igbo regions into one coherent political system was nearly impossible if it were not for one crucial fact: Nigeria was rich in hydrocarbon resources. Thus, it was agreed that no single faction would be allowed to dominate the government. The country's capital, Abuja, was chosen specifically for its neutral location. Moreover, the revenues of some 2.5 million barrels a day were to be distributed from the capital to the remainder of the country. Eventually, the Hausa Fulani faction took control of the country and formed a new government. It became a dictatorship during the rule of General Sani Abacha. However, his successor, Abdul Salami Abubakar, took a different approach. He started the transition of Nigeria towards democracy, and this became the most stable and enduring government in Nigeria's independent history. Then something groundbreaking happened in the 1990s. Despite the fact that the oil pipelines go right through the Niger Delta, the local people received only a very small portion of the oil revenues. After many years of unanswered diplomatic petitions, a new movement rose up in arms in the Niger Delta. The local tribes formed a coalition, with the Ijaw faction taking the lead. The situation escalated quickly, and the movement became a militant organization. This armed conflict reached its peak in the 2000s and is known as the Nigerian oil crisis. By means of guerrilla tactics, the new armed organizations bombed the pipelines, kidnapped foreign workers, and sabotaged the oil facilities. In short, Nigeria's economy was taken hostage. Then, in 2007, a deal was reached between the government and the Ijaw faction. In exchange for the disarmament of the main militant organizations, the Ijaw faction was rewarded with the vice presidency of ethnic Ijaw, Goodluck Jonathan. 3 years later, then President Umara Yar'Adua, a northern Muslim from the Hausa Fulani faction, died of natural causes. Suddenly, Jonathan became the head of the state until 2011. The acting president then emerged victorious from the 2011 presidential elections. In essence, Jonathan's rise to power broke the country's domestic power balance. This was an unforeseen development. The economically impoverished North felt cheated, because the northern president, Yar'Adua, was meant to stay in office for 2 4-year terms, at which point power would be rotated to the other regions. What happened instead was that the North remained in power for about 3 years, and immediately following the death of Yar'Adua, the power shifted to Jonathan, who came to the political arena through means of militancy. At least, this is how the Hausa Fulani faction perceived the events. Either way, the tables had turned. Now it was the Muslim North that was dissatisfied. And just as the Niger Delta rose up in arms, so too did militancy rose up in the north, with Boko Haram taking the lead. As Jonathan mismanaged the country's delicate power balance, Boko Haram grew in importance as a means to restore the historic balance. If you consider all these factors, it may look as if civil war or disintegration is unavoidable for Nigeria's future. However, this is not necessarily true. Nigerians understand their country better than anyone. In the 2015 presidential elections, both the public as well as the leading politicians strongly emphasized on reconciliation and from there de-escalated the situation. Then, in the same elections, Goodluck Jonathan lost and stepped down, making way for Muhammadu Buhari, a president-elect from the northern faction. In essence, the old system of power rotation was restored. So even though Nigeria will remain a highly fragmented nation, the likelihood of descending into civil war is unlikely due to the fact that none of the country's political forces are interested in disrupting the fragile power balance. Nigeria's short-term policy is to stabilize the political landscape and to halt the militant threat posed by Boko Haram and the Niger Delta groups. The mid-term policy is to reduce the economic gap between the north and the south. By doing so, the government will reduce ethnic tensions. Subsequently, this is also Nigeria's long-term policy, managing the ethnic divisions through the distribution of energy revenues. The country's second long-term priority is to prepare for the upcoming population boom. According to UN demographic projections, by 2050, Nigeria's population will surpass that of the US, as the country will exceed 440 million people. That is an enormous increase in a very short span of time. If the above-mentioned points are not solved before the upcoming population boom, Nigeria will face a humanitarian catastrophe, and given its already fragile balance, such a catastrophe could tip the scales and set the stage for the total collapse of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. This was a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. If you would like to support Caspian Report, please visit our Patreon page in the description. For now, thank you for watching, take care, and Sağ ol.